sustainability can't be separated, at least right now, from policy and the policy environment in which we're operating, both as firms, as governments, and at multiple levels of governance, from the federal government to state and locals, and of course other national governments. And so we have an excellent panel, really composed from a broad spectrum of interest to talk about the role of policy in sustainability innovation and supporting the scaling of innovation in sustainability. My name is Michael Wara. I'm the Senior Director of Policy at the Sustainability Accelerator at Stanford. And I'm joined on the panel with, I'll go from, let me see, your left to right, Paul Seagull, who is the CEO of LS Power, the longtime CEO of LS Power. LS Power, for those who don't know about the firm, is one of the largest independent power producers, developers of independent power production in the United States, and also of electric transmission. Sitting next to Paul is Kate Gordon, the CEO of California Forward, which is a statewide economic development NGO. Kate has also held senior roles both with Secretary Granholm at the DOE, where she was a senior advisor, and as a senior policy advisor to Governor Newsom. Sitting next to Kate is Mark Kaine, who is the senior lead for energy and climate at Google. He leads company-wide strategy and execution and external affairs related to energy and climate. And he has previously held roles at the World Economic Forum, the African Union Commission, and the UK Foreign Ministry. So we've got, I think, a really diverse panel, both in terms of expertise at different levels of governance and policy, and also different roles in the ecosystem, right? Government, energy producers, and a large energy consumer, to talk about the policy environment that we're in today, which is obviously very dynamic, and to have a conversation about the path forward for scaling all the innovation that we've been talking about so far today. So I'm going to let Kate take the lead, and we're going to have a few minutes of remarks, and then have a conversation up here, and then hopefully open it up to some questions from the audience as well.
Thanks,
Kate.
Michael. It's great to see everybody and to be here, so thanks for that. I think the question is sort of starting at a high level, why do we care about policy and sustainability? And they are really inextricably intertwined issues. There's two big kind of pieces of this conversation that I think you can't talk about without talking about policy and the role of government. One is just that we are fundamentally looking at an energy transition, and it's not just a bunch of investment into some new technologies that are sort of adding on to a current system. It's an actual transition of the entire system. So that means the underlying infrastructure, transmission, the road systems, the way we do transportation, the way we move electrons, how we use electrons, how we do industry, supply chains. All of that is a transformation from a system that's been fundamentally the same since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that is a kind of a fundamental government role to some extent. Like that underlying infrastructure, most people here thinking about innovation are not thinking about innovation in giant infrastructure systems that are going to underpin all of the projects and companies that you're thinking about. Not thinking about innovation in some of the new big large-scale things that are high risk and need to be de-risked before they can be really in the markets. One of the things you saw in the Biden administration, and I was really thrilled to be part of it, is this approach to green industrial policy that really acknowledged that government plays this fundamental role in de-risking large-scale new things like the hydrogen hubs, the direct air capture hubs, doing large-scale transmission, doing large-scale EV infrastructure charging, just the things that underpin and are the foundation for that innovation. So that's critical. And government's played this role forever. Government played this role with oil and gas, has played this role with tech, has played this role forever on new technology. The other quick thing I'll say is the other really important role of government in this conversation is in the conversation about resilience. Climate change is not just something that requires an energy transition. It is also something that is already creating impacts on our current system, including all of the things you're investing in or innovating around. And keeping those things resilient, building resilience into the system has been to date fundamentally a government role, whether that's wildfire resilience or forest management or flood management or disaster response or thinking about resilient infrastructure in, again, the infrastructure bill, resilient grids. That's been fundamentally a government role because it's a fundamentally long-term thing that doesn't just accrue to one actor or one business. It's sort of a fundamental way of keeping the world safe. And I think that's just an increasing part of the conversation. You really can't talk about energy transition anymore without talking about climate resilience and vice versa. And so both those things are sort of underscore the role of policy. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kate. Paul, do you want to share a perspective from your work at LS Power?
Sure. Look, I think, so we face the commercial side of the world, and I would say that in our world, it often boils down to dollars, and our North Star around those dollars ends up being economics, and it ends up being policy, and oftentimes the way that policy is converted into economic price signals. You can think about our business as very much a deployment engine, an investment engine. We, as Michael mentioned, we are a large developer of competitive high voltage transmission, and the competitive piece of that is important because they're opening up transmission development to competition really changes the dynamic from the traditional utility model where utilities are economically incentivized to effectively spend as much as is reasonable to get something built. Oftentimes, the way that we win business is by protecting the customer from cost exceedances. That's a policy decision fundamentally. Several years ago, we decided that we were going to make a concerted effort to put a company together that could purchase renewable assets that were running towards the end of their contract life. There isn't a natural buyer of those assets, but many of the assets reside in markets where you have renewable energy credits. And there's, again, fundamental work that you can do if you believe that that policy is durable to have a view, develop a view, ultimately convert that view on pricing of renewable energy credits into contracted revenue, and build, expand, repower assets. And those are just a few examples. We've been a meaningful and very early deployer of battery storage here in California. We built 2 of the largest battery storage projects in the world. At this point, well over 5 to 7 years ago. And we built them here in California because of really 2 things. And we thought that these 2 things were very durable. One, California's efforts to transition off of natural gas as a power generation fuel, and California's carbon program. Both of those things allowed us to take the view that over time, there would be a very deep market to buy inexpensive electrons in the middle of the day, but that we'd be able to sell those electrons back to the grid, where the grid would be avoiding, by absorbing our electrons, the need to dispatch reasonably high cost gas, and then to pay for those gas producers to pay an incremental price for the carbon on top of that. So again, policy is probably the most important thing from an innovation perspective that we can do to direct the path of capital and intellectual capital towards the energy system that we want.
Thanks, Paul. Mark, do you want to share a perspective about where Google is on this issue right now?
Sure, happy to. And thanks to the organizers for having me. And great to see so many people here today for a panel on policy. It's not every day that there's such excitement in the room about this topic. So, I want to just start with doubling down on a point that Kate made, which is that we're really talking about innovation in a way that's grander and more fundamental than we typically think about it. what we need to do to complete a successful energy transition is really nothing short of completely re-architecting and turning over the entire infrastructural system that powers our modern economy and our society. And it won't be news to people in this room that energy really is the lifeblood of our modern world. And so the stakes here are really high. From critical infrastructure like hospitals, communication networks, transportation systems, to the devices in everyone's pockets that we're all now using to learn and work and organize our lives. We rely so much on energy, and it's really a miracle that allows us to both survive and live lives of dignity and prosperity, but also to thrive and to reach our fullest potential. And unfortunately, as we all know, there's a catch, and that's that we've been running this system for a very long time, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, on carbon-emitting sources. And now this very system that has created all of this prosperity and allowed so much growth and opportunity is now posing an ever greater threat to our continued ability to enjoy that prosperity. And so I think we're at a critical juncture. I'm going to talk a little bit about Google, but just to really start at that macro level. On the one hand, we need to meet growing energy needs here in the US, but also around the world, where billions of people still don't enjoy the kind of prosperity that so many of us in this room have come to take for granted. But on the other hand, we need to do so in a way that doesn't come at the expense of our communities, of our infrastructure, of our children's future, and so much more. My point of view on that, and Michael mentioned that I've spent a lot of my career in policy, is that policy is absolutely critical, perhaps the critical lever to achieve that. And I'm just going to say a little bit about how we're thinking about and approaching that at Google, which may sound strange. I think Google is probably better known as a technology company. We've pushed the frontier of technology on things like AI, search engines, all of that. And even in the domain of energy, the things that we are often talked about as being a leader on are things like our work on advanced nuclear with Kairos Power, our deal with hometown Stanford hero Fervo Energy to be their first customer to buy their advanced geothermal power. But for me and for the team, over the last couple of decades working on meeting Google's growing energy needs with clean energy, we have learned that really the critical unlock to be able to get that to happen, both for us and for the broader systems that serve us, are often in the policy domain. And in pretty much every region where we operate, policy plays a critical role in shaping what's possible, what's economical, how fast things can happen, at what scale they can grow to. And in many of those places, and I'll talk about a few of them over the course of the panel, we've come to feel that helping to improve policy is the single most important thing that we can do as a company to expand clean energy, both to meet our own growth and our desire to do so cleanly, but also to drive that broader transition that needs to happen in so many different regions around the world. So talking about policy specifically, I think one of the things that I'm proud of at Google is that we've really been very proactive and very constructive for a long time on engaging in the policy domain. Just last week, we released a new paper with 15 policy recommendations to unlock reliable, affordable, clean energy here in the US. Happy to discuss that more in the panel. And I'm especially proud of it because this is a time where there's a lot of uncertainty, there are a lot of political cross currents, and we really focus on finding what we feel are pragmatic, broad-based proposals that we feel there are a lot of reasons to get behind, and that we hope we'll be able to make some traction over in DC, notwithstanding all of the back and forth that are happening there as recently as this morning. But I'm just gonna dive into one example just to really illustrate this in more detail, and I'm gonna start closer to home and with something more recent. So just yesterday, the Nevada Public Utilities Commission approved something that we call a clean transition tariff. And this is a new, scalable, utility and regulatory model that we developed to accelerate the deployment of clean firm technologies like nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture and storage, and more. And the basic gist is that through this model, large energy users like Google can partner with utilities, in this case, NV Energy, to invest in early, first or second of a kind commercial projects for these technologies in a way that helps reduce the long-term costs of those technologies, while critically ensuring that over the short term, any increased costs are not borne by regular ratepayers. So we partnered with NV Energy to roll this out, but our ability to do so was ultimately subject to approval by Nevada's regulator. As of yesterday, having secured that approval, we can now move forward on our first project, which is another deal with Vervo Energy to deliver 115 megawatts of new geothermal to the grid that powers our data centers, as well as millions of customers in Nevada. So it's just one example, but I think it captures something really important that to me just really underscores why it's so important that we at Google, but also everyone in this room and beyond, cares about policy. You know, yesterday we had yesterday morning before this approval, we had a beautiful set of documents and emails that put forth a really innovative plan for how a forward-leaning off-taker like Google and a advanced clean tech startup like Vervo and an ambitious utility like NV Energy could theoretically do this really cool thing that we all wanted to do. And this morning, we're all waking up and getting to work, getting the dollars out the door, getting the steel in the ground, and creating the jobs and getting the clean power flowing onto the grid. So that, to me, in a nutshell, is really the power of policy to scale sustainability innovation. And looking forward to talking more about all of that with this group.
So I'm going to ask actually all three of you a question next, and I think it's important. Like this time is so dynamic, and I think for people that have worked on climate for a long time, it can be a little bit depressing at times. I mean, I'll say how I feel about it, but I think we also need to focus on where the opportunities are. And I'm curious, as all of you look at sort of policy environment and the energy landscape, pretty broadly, where do you see, what are you most excited about in terms of pursuing opportunities in the next few years, even in the next 12 months, as you think about your landscape and your work and your ability to influence policy? I'm going to put someone on the spot here, if you don't. Kate, what do you think? Where do you see reason for optimism that you can make progress?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is a very strange time right now. But you know, I spend a lot of time thinking about the energy transition and have for many years. And one of the things I think is really interesting is this opportunity to we were talking about this earlier, repurpose industrial sites that are from the current energy system into something for the new energy system. And the reason I'm really excited about that is a couple things. One is that if you repurpose existing industrial land, you're not developing a whole bunch of new industrial land. When we do that, we tend to do it on greenfield, and greenfield development is not great for the climate, as well as not being great for communities. And there's a lot of reasons it's not great. It creates a lot more vehicle travel, and shuts down greenfield sites that could be climate resilient. And there's a bunch of reasons not to do it. But it's very cool if you can find ways to use industrial land for new things. And I've been thinking a lot about a couple of places of doing that. Nationally, I did a lot of work for the Biden administration. I staffed the secretary on the coal transition plan for the administration. And thinking about coal communities is really interesting because both mining and then we were thinking a lot about mining communities and power plant communities. And in mining communities, in the infrastructure bill, there was a whole program around putting solar on former mine sites, which is super interesting because these are these large swaths of land that need to be remediated and reclaimed, but also are a real opportunity because they've already been essentially made flat, which is what you need for solar. And that's a really interesting opportunity. So there was like direct support for that, which was fascinating, and a lot of excitement in these mining communities to do that. Doesn't necessarily create the same level of jobs as mining, but there are opportunities for things like offtake agreements to pay for, to use electricity for other economic activities. The other thing we did a lot of work on was coal plant transition. This is sort of a global thing. Coal plant transition, particularly related to nuclear, turning coal plants into small modular reactor sites is really interesting, or other types of energy generation. Coal plants have this hugely valuable thing, which is that they have interconnection to the grid, and they're existing industrial land with permits, and they tend to have water sources. So those are interesting assets to build on. Here in California, doing a lot of work on refinery transition, which is a complicated conversation, but I think a really important one. And thinking about, how do we think about refineries as potential sites for, yes, for biorefining, but for bioeconomy campuses, where you're also thinking about bioplastics and other materials. These are large sites that are brownfields. And so how do we think about keeping them for industry? So I think that's really important. It sort of is a way in to talk about some of the community impact stuff, because you've sort of already done industry, and so you're now continuing to do industry, but it's cleaner. It's also a really interesting way to talk about permitting and siting, the sort of abundance agenda, because in every case, these sites have already gone through environmental review, and there is a really robust conversation about limiting environmental review for reuse of industrial sites if what you're doing is less dirty than the thing that was there before. So I think it's interesting, and just an area we should all be paying a lot of attention to.
Paul, where do you see opportunity in the
I'm gonna
current?
quickly tack on to something that Kate mentioned. We are working on a roughly 300 megawatt solar project on a former remediated mine in West Virginia. Interestingly enough, what we found is that the geotech on these sites is a little bit more complicated, a little bit more expensive. So the provisions in the IRA that provide for an incremental tax credit related to coal communities is actually a really important component of what makes that project site competitive with other project sites, albeit maybe harder to piece together 300 megawatts of scale. But to get the economics to be roughly equivalent, that 10% adder is really critical.
I helped write that section, so I'm glad someone's doing something with it.
Very nice. No, it really is. It's critically important.
It's
to
my
that
one
project.
claim to fame in IRA. So.
Yeah. Look, I think there are times when we need to play defense. This is one of them. I am excited, however, about the competitive transmission opportunity and the opportunity to do more with resources that we already have, or unlock resources that are available to us. Again, sort of focusing here in California. California has taken a few bold steps where they've put forward as public policy projects transmission expansions that would allow us to bring completely new, with a completely different production profile, wind resources into the state, and unlocking, frankly, thousands, if not tens of thousands of incremental solar megawatts from locations in the state where there just isn't strong transmission to bring those assets to market. I think there's a lot of that type of opportunity with side benefits that through transmission we can just utilize a broader set of assets much more efficiently.
I'm gonna piggyback on Paul's answer, but take it in a slightly different direction, and maybe take your provocation, Michael, to think about the next 12 months even. Obviously, it's a very fluid and complex time at the national level, and in many states and other countries. And I also think there do continue to be opportunities, and we're discovering new ones every day for very practical but very impactful things that they can really scale. And just looking at the grid and the transmission question specifically, this was one of the big focus areas for the US policy paper that we released earlier this month. And the reason we focus so much on it is that there's a well understood and documented need for more transmission for all of the reasons that Paul highlights. And so we're very supportive of building that transmission and unlocking the policy that's necessary to do so. And at the same time, looking at that 12-month time frame, it's a pretty heavy lift. Paul probably knows better than any of us how hard it is to build transmission and how long those timelines are and how the costs tend to escalate. And so we need to do that, and we're advocating to continue doing that. And one thing that I think in the meantime we can and should be doing much more vigorously than we are is thinking about how can we unlock more capacity from the existing grid assets that we already have. And this is an area where we see a huge amount of opportunity. Some of it's technological, There is a really exciting set of technologies that are broadly lumped under the category of grid enhancing technologies, which can increase the ability of existing grid assets and infrastructure to move power across them. We feel that the current grid is underutilized, and there's a lot more that we can and should be getting out of it, and policy will be a really important ingredient to accelerate progress in that direction. The other thing that we're focused a lot on, and this is maybe more in the realm of market design and regulation than policy as such, but we see a huge opportunity for more flexible demand across the electricity system to enable better optimization of demand across the system, and in some cases to avoid the need for new capacity, new generating capacity to be built in the near term. And so particularly as we're dealing with this very rapid load growth across the country that's driven by any number of factors, the electrification of transport and heat, the growth of data centers and AI, just background economic growth, and all of these other things. Figuring out how these new growing loads can be more dynamic and better interface with the existing system, building in flexibility so that instead of having to build new power plants to meet the 100, 200 hours of extremely peak demand during the year, you can think about how to leverage these big and in some cases small distributed assets to just lower their demand during those periods to avoid the need for that new investment. As the Google person, I would be remiss not to say that I think there are also some really interesting opportunities here for AI. We have recently announced a partnership with PJM, the biggest grid operator in the East Coast, to roll out some of our AI systems across their grid planning process to do better modeling of what different scenarios would look like in the future and inform current decision making with better understanding of what the implications of different decisions may be. I think we're just at the beginning of that journey at Google and across the system, and it's something that I think we should be focusing more on, and that policy could also give a really nice tailwind to enable us to move faster.
Curious if any of you are willing to sort of, there's a lot of, I'll just say, there's a lot of, this panel has a lot of electricity sector expertise sitting on it. And I think in the electricity space, we have made not all the progress we need to make, but we are on a trajectory to, and have made a tremendous amount of progress over the last decade in moving toward a more sustainable electric system. And we should all be proud of that, and we should be thinking, and that includes de-risking technologies, moving them from kind of prototype to scale, the kinds of early deployments that we're all talking about, building more transmission, especially connecting new sources of generation. There's a lot of lessons potentially in this space, and there are other spaces in the sustainability context, sustainable innovation context, that maybe haven't made as much progress, especially in, as Paul, as you described, like turning de-risking a technology so that you can turn policy into an economic thesis that's investable. If you were speaking to a company, a policymaker that's really focused on a different space, say agriculture or water, what would you say the most important lessons are that you could apply from the electricity space to these other sustainability domains that are also very important, but where maybe we're earlier in a journey toward a more sustainable outcome?
It's a really good question. I mean, it is just harder to do this in some of these other spaces precisely because the great thing about electricity is that the wires can move a bunch of things, like the electrons can be from a bunch of different sources and the wires are the same and the turning on the light's the same, right? So like there's a bunch of the infrastructure that's the same and we have to improve it and it has to be more flexible and we have to build more of it. But it's not like in transportation, for instance, where in some cases you're talking about entirely new vehicles, entirely new charging infrastructure, entirely new road constructs. Like it's a very, very different thing. And also going from, look, the system, petroleum-based system is just a very clear, like there's a bunch of extraction and then refining and then moving things around, and it's a globally traded commodity and it's in everything. So I think that one of the things that's really important is like looking at the lesson from electricity, and I think a lot about coal, obviously, but a big reason we moved off coal in the United States to the extent we did was because natural gas showed up as an alternative that was fairly easy to plug and play into the same system. How do we think about that in other systems, right? What are the other opportunities to do that? What are the opportunities to have the same farm equipment, but have it use a different kind of liquid fuel that's more sustainable? I think we should be thinking about liquid fuel. Liquid fuel is much more of a plug and play thing than electrifying all the vehicles. How do we think about that in the context of agriculture, of heavy duty, of industry? That doesn't necessarily mean ethanol. It means we're innovative people. Like, let's think about more sustainable liquid fuel alternatives. I think hydrogen's really interesting in a fuel cell context for transportation. I think we should be thinking about ways that we can make it easier for people to transition, not telling people they need to do it because they're the problem, which is often what happens, unfortunately, in the climate advocacy space. Is you kind of come into a conversation with a farmer and you're like, here is my chart on the part of the problem that is you. Let's talk about what you're going to do about that, instead of here is something, kind of like the way we've sold EVs, right? Here is something that is better and more, and I can make it affordable, it's better, it's going to work better, it's going to save you a bunch of money, and it's going to work the same. It's going to do the same things you need it to do. You're not going to have to fundamentally change everything in your practices. We do have to think about that. Yes, there's going to have to be some practices that change, but I actually just think we have to be smarter about industrial applications, agricultural applications that allow for people to keep doing some level of what they understand how to do and have made money doing. Most of these folks are working at extraordinarily narrow margins. They're not in a position to invest in a whole bunch of new machinery and practices. They're in a position to think about capital stock turnover. That's the last thing I'll say. Let's look at capital stock turnover moments as a chance to have these conversations instead of trying to set artificial deadlines that frankly don't work for a lot of the economy.
I'll be quick just to follow up on that. I think from my limited perspective, a lot of these fights, while most effectively fought at the federal level, those are really heavy lifts. Oftentimes, it can just be much easier to find a good fit with state policy and find states where you can demonstrate that a policy plus innovation and technology work nicely together. And then ideally that system can be shown as a successful precedent to other states that may move in the direction to adopt it. So as a matter of advice, I would probably start by focusing on some states where there's a good fit between their interest and the technology or innovation that somebody is looking to roll out.
That's fair.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I think California in particular historically has been a great example of that, and Kate has personally been at the forefront of several of those particular examples, and so agree with that. I'll be quick too. I think really my best advice, and this is a great question because we tend to get very deep in the electricity and the energy space for good reason. It's an important space, but there are other important spaces, and the ones that are jumping to my mind mainly because they're big aspects of our own operational kind of plant, as well as our footprint, both for energy and carbon, are building materials, things like concrete, steel, which tend to be lumped into the hard to decarbonize sector categories, and are compared to power, as Kate said, more distributed. There are a lot more different suppliers. You don't have one single system that if you just bring new things on and take old things off, the whole system changes. You really have to kind of go deeper, up the supply chain, and work it in a more bespoke way. But that being said, I guess my advice to the policymaker would be to really look for where are the points of leverage and how can policy help move on those things. And three that jump to my mind, to Kate's earlier point, and it would have been better if we had started more of this 20 years ago, but the government has historically played this extraordinary role in catalyzing fundamental science that can turn into applied science, that can turn into commercialized new products that can enter markets. And there are 1,000 examples, but it's one thing that government can do uniquely well. It has more firepower behind it financially. It has, in many cases, very good institutions and structures set up to do it. And so, and I would say also, on energy, I think we have some great examples of how we've done that, certainly in the US through ARPA-E and the national labs and other approaches that have really accelerated the commercialization of new ideas from the lab out into the market. But so, really taking that mindset across these other domains and, making up for the lack of, investment that we, probably should have been putting into those for several decades now. The other two things that the policy role is a little bit less sort of, it has to be government, but I think government can be very helpful. On the supply side, particularly if you look at something like cement, there are a million different small mom and pop shops who make concrete mix around the world. But there are actually only, a single digit number of massive global cement companies who collectively have a level of market share that, were they to work together in the way that we've seen historically other industries have done, for example, the iron and steel industry in Japan, starting in the 80s and up to the present day, if they were to work together across the industry to set some collective targets and set some collective research and development and commercialization efforts into motion, I think that would really help move the whole industry forward in a way that got through some of the competitive dynamics between those different suppliers and just tried to kind of lift the whole space in concert. And then finally on the demand side, something that we've done a lot in the energy space, but we've seen be really successful in other areas, including carbon removals, is pooling demand from catalytic buyers who want to help bring these technologies into the market, are willing to pay some amount of green premium, and who can do a lot more together than they'd be able to do separately. And we've started engaging in some efforts on this at Google around concrete, cement specifically, and around metals and steel and building materials. But I would say that those efforts in general around the world are far more nascent than what we've seen in energy. So there is some catch up to play.
Well, just really quickly to build on that, I think sort of what we keep talking about is you have to think about innovation within an existing system. So that requires transition of an existing system, and how do you find opportunity in leveraging the existing system. But also, we have a whole bunch of stuff we've already done. Like, there's probably enough plastic in the world right now for us to never have to make any more plastic and just figure out ways to reuse all the existing plastic, because it's not going anywhere. It's not being biodegrading. So how do we think about that? Like with steel, recycled steel is a huge part of the answer to sustainability in steel. How do you think about that? Like innovation in reuse and deconstruction in sort of creative reuse, I think is super interesting, and goes also to your water question, just in that, like, we are going to have to do that with resources. We are running out of water in a lot of places. We are running out of other resources. We need to be thinking about these creative reuse and kind of, recycling approaches that don't have to be like taking your medicine. They can be interesting innovation opportunities.
So I think we have, if we're quick about it, we have time for one question from the audience. Does anyone
Has to be a really good question.
A really brave audience member.
Nice.
The best question.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a really, really great panel. So wanted to talk about the states. If we think about something like Texas versus California, we've got a lot more renewables deployed in Texas than in California. And recently, I think a Google company, Renew Home, just announced the biggest virtual power plant in Texas, along with OhmConnect. Those companies, at least OhmConnect, got started in California, where the demand response auction mechanism got shut down. And a lot of companies have struggled to interact with utilities. And so part of like the California-Texas dichotomy that we've seen is, what Kate talked about with the abundance agenda and difficulty in getting permits and building green infrastructure. But part of that is the utility model too, and that cuts across a lot of other examples. So, we have a set of institutions, within the abundance agenda that haven't kept up with our times. And I think this utility model in a lot of states is a really good example. And so wondering what you guys are seeing in terms of any viable paths to utility model, business model reform that could be some bright spots or where you see opportunities?
I'd love to hit that with competitive transmission at the very top of my list. I do think that those are one of the big differences outside of the fact that the Texas market now is just much larger than the California market for power, is the speed to interconnection. Texas has a model where, again, policy, they allow for interconnection without all of the necessary grid upgrades to occur. And what that results in is that transfers the congestion risk, the risk that you can't get that power to the right place in the market, to the developer, owner of the asset. Whereas here in California, to get full credit for an asset, we need that asset to be able to provide deliverable capacity. That means we need network upgrades. That means some of the projects that we're working on to enable those new generation assets are 8 to 10 years out, deliverable in the future. And again, these are policy choices at the end of the day.
We are at time, so I'm going to not stand between all of you and lunch, but let's just thank the panel. It's been an incredible conversation and a really great day.